in the spirit of, I think, Peter, it was you maybe who mentioned clickbait. Yes, so someone mentioned, maybe David, mentioned clickbait yesterday. In the spirit of clickbait and acknowledging that this is the post-lunch session, clickbait has this habit of giving you something that you want to look at and then making you watch the entire video to the very end by saying, you won't believe what number 5 is. You know, top 5 things, you won't believe number 5. So in the spirit of that, can you all tell me what has repeatedly been said in terms of the shape of a sermon? What has been said as, what do we preachers find most difficult to do? What have people said over and over again over 2 days? Structure. What else? There's been a big one that people have mentioned numbers of times. Application. Most people who've said stuff from the front have said application is tricky and difficult and something that they need to work on. So in the spirit of clickbait, I'm here to basically tell you how I prepare a sermon. This is the very idealistic view of how I prepare a sermon. I'm going to put that right at the front. But you just won't believe how easy I will make application for you when you get to the end. So in the spirit of clickbait, that's what we're doing. So yeah, this session, I want it to be, if you want to interrupt me and ask a question, do it. Because what I'm really trying to do here, synthesize everything that we've talked about so far and kind of just give you an insight into how I go about preparing a sermon, the things I'm thinking through, how all those threads that we've been looking at come together. So if you just want to ask a question, feel free to do that. So basically, the sermon begins normally on a Monday for me, if I'm preaching week by week in the life of a church, and it's the initial engagement with the passage. We've talked about this, that you spend time in the passage. Most people have said, look, I just want to spend time in the passage, and that's the same for me. I want to read and reread. I've put in brackets there, listen. What I'll often do is I'll listen to the passage or listen to a couple of chapters either side of the passage, because I often find when I read, this might be just a me thing, when I read, I very quickly in my head start jumping ahead to the bits that I know or the bit that I'm most interested in, and I skim over other bits. But when I listen, something strikes me. Oh, was that in this passage? And I don't want that the first time for that to happen be when the person is reading the Bible before I get up to preach. Oh, I totally missed that. So I listen to it, I read it, I try and immerse myself in it. The things I'm looking for in this time are things like context. Where does this passage fit in the book that we're preaching through, in the Testament that it's a part of, in the whole Bible? I'm just really just trying to get those thoughts into my head, not without anything technical about that. I just really want to go, where's this fit? What genre is it? Remind myself of that. If we're in the Psalms like we are at the moment for a few weeks at church, this is poetry, this is song. That's what I'm reminding myself of. I start thinking, just initially, of anywhere I've heard these verses in this passage anywhere else in the Bible. So if I know that this psalm is quoted somewhere else in the New Testament, I start thinking about that. That's important for me to think about. It's just those little cross references. Is the passage referenced by the New Testament? Is a New Testament passage going to refer to something that happened in the Old Testament? Is an epistle referring to something that happened in the Gospels or Acts? Those kinds of things. I'm just doing those things in my head. The next thing I really want to do is I want to feel the gravity and the gladness of the passage. So in my reading, in my engagement with it, I want to feel it. I stole that from Piper. He talks about that, I think, in his book, The Supremacy of God and Preaching. And he talks about a sermon needing to have gravity and gladness. And so I want to feel that. I want to feel, how does this passage make me feel the weight of what it's trying to communicate? How does it lighten me? How does it lift my burdens? Those kinds of things. Reactions. And so I use my version of the Wycliffe story, the Bible. I don't know if anyone's engaged with that, but Wycliffe had this way of talking to people who aren't literate by telling Bible stories in different cultures around the world, and they get them to react to the story. So I'm thinking about what surprised me about this story, what was difficult, what confused me in this story, what did I really like in this story. So I'm looking at the passage and just trying to react to it in those ways. And then I ask myself, what might somebody or me take exception to in this passage? Is there something here that's going to be a massive red flag for people listening to this passage? So I'm just trying to think through the passage, engage with as much as I can, feel the weight of the passage, and react to it in some way. So that's my initial, and that for me is Monday. And so Monday for me, my engagement with the passage is that. Then I'm very, very good. Like, one of the things I think I'm good at is being able to think about that throughout the day when I'm doing other things, driving, practicing my golf swing, whatever it is I'm doing. I can think about that and just have it stewing away in my brain. I don't have to be sitting down in front of a computer or a notepad and pen. I can sort of store things away in my brain, which is really helpful for me. It's how I sort of stew on the passage until some point on Tuesday when I write down a bit of an outline of what I think the sermon's going to look at, so I can send it to the worship leader and they can be getting ready for the service. And so that's the sort of start, my initial engagement with the passage. Then my big goal is to find the author's intent. That's my big goal, and this is exegesis for me. So my main goal is to discover the intent of the biblical author in writing this passage, and that's because of my doctrine of inspiration, which we've mentioned a number of times. The author's intent is God's intent for the passage. And so I strive to find what is the author actually talking about here. So this involves exegesis, which is drawing meaning out from the text. That's what it means. So I'm diving into the text to find the meaning. What is this Bible author talking about? Narrowing in context even more. Who is the author? Who are they writing to? Why are they writing to them? So those things that you can often find in the first 50 pages of a commentary on a book, the critical issues that it deals with, they're the things that I'm looking for. Then I'm going deeper and looking at the structure of the passage. How does the author's chosen structure contribute to their intent? Have they written this in poetry, or have they quoted an Old Testament verse? Have they formulated a very careful argument that's logical and step by step? Have they referred to another happening or a story? I'm looking at how they've structured it because I want to know how that structure contributes to their argument. I look at the language that they've used. How does their choice of language contribute to their intent and their argument? So commentaries are helpful for this. So you can look at, I tend to err towards exegetical commentaries, ones that sort of pick the passage apart a fair bit. David mentioned a couple of resources yesterday. I use the Bible.org. They have an excellent kind of spread of Bibles, so you can bring up different versions, so NIV, ESV, CSB, side by side, Greek text. You can click on a Greek word there and it'll parse it, it'll give you all the uses of it, all on the one page. It doesn't move from that page, it just opens up that bottom window, and so you can see all the different times it's used in the New Testament. That's free. I know a lot of people have got paid for accordance and logos and that kind of stuff. For me, this is really helpful for my purposes. In the Old Testament, I use the Bible Hub like David does because it brings up the Hebrew there. I'm nowhere near as versed in Hebrew as I am in Greek, and so this is helpful for me in that regard. I kind of fall on commentaries when it comes to understanding Hebrew more than my own understanding. With Greek, I'm a lot better at understanding that. The other thing I use in the New Testament is this book. You might have used it in Bible college if you've been to Bible college. Rogers and Rogers. I found it really helpful in all my exegesis subjects. It basically just goes verse by verse through the New Testament, and it pulls out the key Greek words, and it gives you sort of other uses of it. It gives you meaning, gives you why different interpreters have chosen that. That's just a book that I used for reference in college. So if there's particular tricky passages, or when I'm reading through it, sometimes that's really helpful for me. So I think I need to go back now to this one, and we'll jump ahead in a minute. So from all of this, I'm trying to look at what conclusions or applications is the author trying to make. What are they trying to do? What are they trying to get across as their big goal in writing this? One of the beauties of the inspiration of Scripture, that God inspired human authors to do it in real time, in real moments, is that you know that the text of the Bible wasn't written by accident. It wasn't just an aimless meditations of somebody. It was written for a purpose. So I'm trying to find that. And my goal is to come up with a statement of the author's intent. I just want to come up with a crystal clear idea. This is what Paul is speaking about in this passage. This is what David meant when he wrote this psalm. This is the kind of crystal clear, make it as easy as I can to communicate to myself more than anything. Just a couple of tips to avoid eisegesis at this point. So eisegesis is the competitor to exegesis. Eisegesis means that you are inserting meaning into the text rather than drawing meaning out of the text. So for me, it's things like I don't listen to any other sermon on this passage in my preparation. Anytime before I've preached. So I mentioned to some of the guys before, sometimes I've listened to one after to sort of give me feedback. How did this person deal with the passage so that I can compare what I did? But I don't want to bring in someone else's ideas. So I try to avoid that. I try not to let preconceived ideas about the passage influence my thinking. So what I want to do is not go, oh, I know I'm preaching on Psalm 2 this coming Sunday. I know this passage is about this, just because I just know it. I try to avoid that. I try to come to that passage without those preconceived ideas. It's tricky to do, but I try not to. I try to let the passage speak. And that's one of the reasons I listen, because I'm listening to the passage and just letting it speak to me. I'm hearing what it says. Try to catch yourself shoehorning things in. And that's hard to do, but really fight. I really want to talk about this because that's been on my mind recently. So you might have been watching the news and you might be like, oh, the thing that's happening with Palestine and Israel, I want to shoehorn that in. Stop yourself from doing that. Try really hard to be disciplined, not to just be thinking of, and if it's too coincidental, if you think, oh, this passage is definitely talking about this thing I've been thinking about, how awesome is that? Maybe catch yourself at that moment and just double check that you're not trying to shoehorn that thing in. Beck and I have been watching a detective drama thing that we've been watching over the last few months when we get a chance to watch a TV show, and they follow cases, and oftentimes it involves, Hollywood style things. It involves potentially another officer's been involved in this crime, and the people are like, well, what do we do? How do we objectively deal with this crime and investigate this crime? And they have this phrase that's been said right throughout the series, wherever it leads. Wherever it leads. So if it leads to a cop that's been involved, it leads there and we have to follow it. For me, I've loved this phrase for thinking about preaching and thinking about a passage, wherever it leads. So don't let my own thoughts or external stuff impact. I just want to go to the passage, and wherever it leads, that's where my sermon's going to go. Any questions, thoughts on exegesis before we move on? Yes, Chuck?
Are there any times where wherever it leads is taking you somewhere that you really want to go?
Yeah, well, it's funny, like I feel like where Josh said before, there's like an excitement about tricky and difficult things. I kind of one of those sick people that if it does lead somewhere that's a bit difficult and hard, I kind of revel in that. So it's not like it doesn't lead where I want it to go. I kind of feel like there's definitely been times where even having half started a sermon, where I've gone, hang on a minute, this is leading in a very different direction than where I'd initially thought. And so I've had to scrap everything and start again. And Beck will know those days because it's the days that I haven't got home until much later. And she's like, how's the sermon going? And I'm like, I had to scrap everything and start again. It happens. So it's not so much the topic or the place that it leads or the idea makes me feel, oh no, I didn't want to go here. It's more, oh no, I have to rip up the sermon and start again, or throw out a section of the sermon or something like that. Yeah, Tony.
What if you feel like the congregation needs something? How do you balance that versus like shoehorn?
Yeah, I think if it was a desperate need because of something that was universal to my congregation, I would consider breaking a series and doing an individual message. So I mentioned yesterday, like if a pastor in the church died, you'd want to do something to address that because it's universal to the whole congregation. If it's, I would say probably my flesh going, I know there's some people in the church that need to hear this. I just trust. I have to trust that if I'm preaching the whole counsel of God, it will come up eventually. So it's that blend of knowing whether that thing is universal and worth stopping to address, or whether that thing is something that's more me going, it would be really good if some of the people in our church got a hold of this. Okay, well, I'll just trust that God will bring that when he brings it. And that's a discipline in many ways to go, I've committed to preach through, well, like we're going to start John at the start of February and preach that for most of this year. I've committed to that. Under God, us elders sat around, talked and prayed about what to preach. We've landed on John. We trust that this is how God will speak. So unless there's something universal to the congregation, I'm just going to keep doing that and wait and be patient. Rory.
How do you go about identifying maybe the universal view of the church versus the universal one? Yeah, because things go up sometimes in the news and everyone's agreeing, what people challenge by it or talk about it. There's probably times to pray about, but I guess identifying going like, yeah, that might be something everyone's thinking about, but we need to stop.
Yeah, I think if it's a tragedy, say like Bondi or something like that happens, we've tended to err on the side of lamenting as a church for that. And so in our newsletter, I wrote a prayer of lament for Bondi and sort of everything surrounding it so that our church could find that there's a way that I could lead the church to deal with that. Yeah, so there's very few things that I would break a series for unless it personally affected a large proportion of the church. And so it's that personal affection that we deal with. We had a young lady who was part of our church who tragically died in an accident. She left our church and gone to another church, but her parents were still part of the church. And so it was time to sort of say, hang on a minute, this service this Sunday is going to be very different, because she was the Sunday school teacher for all the kids that are now like teenagers and that in the church and stuff. So, this is something that we're going to stop because it personally affects us. It's not something that just happened in the news and people are like interested in or maybe thinking about. That I'm going to deal with in other ways through conversations, pastoral catch-ups or dealing with a prayer of lament or something that our people can be led and shepherded to how to deal with that well. Yeah. All right. Next thing I'm trying to do is what I call the preaching intent. So I've got the author's intent. I've figured that out. I know what the author is saying. Now I want to have a preaching intent. And this is something that maybe we don't do as well as we could. Taking that author's intent and thinking about the audience that I'm going to be sharing it with. So thinking about my audience, because I will package that author's intent into my sermon in a different way depending on the audience. So I think about their age, their gender, their faith. So is it me preaching at the high school chapel at Northside Christian College? They're all like, if it's junior chapel, they're like 12 to 14. So it's a very different audience to preaching at the nursing home that our church has a connection with. Very different audiences, right? So I'm going to package things differently. A men's event is going to be different than the whole church. We have men and women together. I think about the level of faith that they have. Are these people all believers that I'm speaking to? Am I preaching at a Bible college chapel where everyone there is more than likely a believer and really well along in their faith and mature in their faith? So I think about that. I think about the different things, the occasion of the sermon, because there's sensitivities, right, to particular occasions. I'm going to choose what I speak about, how I communicate the author's intent sensitively based on the occasion of the event. And then what's the overall goal? Is it the regular preaching on a Sunday morning, dripping the gospel into my people week by week over the course of however many years God gives me in this church? Or is it a very specific outreach event? Is it like a Bible college chapel? What's the purpose of this? Is it to edify believers, call people to salvation, challenge people to a particular change in their behavior? What's the ultimate goal? What's the brief that I have been given here? From this, my goal is to kind of repackage my author's intent into a preaching intent, a clear statement that I want to impress upon the people that I'm speaking to. And this probably looks like very close to what my main point is going to be. Very close to what, word for word, you might even hear me say in a sermon. It's going to be very close to that. I'm trying to narrow down exactly what that big point is through this process. And what that leads me to is coming up with what I call the key question. And this is taking the author's intent and my preaching intent and from that to formulate a key question that my sermon will answer. Because I believe it is the key question the passage answers. So David, you called it something else yesterday. You called it the dominant idea. You also called it the why do the people, the urgency that the people have. You called it something else. I can't think of it now. Anyway, it was like the impetus, the what makes the people want to listen to this. This is what I'm trying to get at here. Is there a big question that this passage answers? And that's the question I want to kind of frame my sermon around and my argument around. Now here's something that maybe we haven't spoken about as much, but I want to form a coherent argument. This is what I want to do. I've got my big question. I know how my passage answers it, so I want to get people from A to B. I want to get people from the question to the answer through the text of the passage. That's what I want to do. So my argument needs to be coherent. God is a God of order. He's not a God of disorder. So chaotically sprouting out random stuff isn't going to be helpful for anybody, and it's not going to be godly. It's not going to give people a picture of what our God is like. And so I need to work hard to make my sermon follow a coherent argument. So things that help me with this are signposting the question. I'm very clear early in the sermon, this is the big question. Oftentimes my opening illustration is a way of asking that question for people, of getting them to think about that question and think about their need to find an answer to that question. And so I want to signpost that question, and I want to say to people in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the sermon, I don't want them, missing out on the fact that this is actually what we're doing today. This is what you can expect. You're going to expect an answer to this question. So from Sunday, if I can remember, get my brain back in that space, Psalm 2, you have this concept of David being able to ask, why do the nations rage? And it's not a question of lament. Oh, why are the nations rage? It's a question of futility. Why are the nations bothering to rage when God sits in heaven and laughs at them? That's what David's asking. So my sermon was framed around the idea of asking how, when the nations are raging all around us, like they are at the moment, how can we have the same attitude that David has here? How can we look at the nations raging and go, why are they bothering? How can we not be affected and overpowered and overwhelmed by that? So that's my big question. And I show them that there's a God who reigns through the passage of Psalm 2, and a God who will bring judgment against raging nations. And that's answering it. So I'm going to try to get them from A to B, but I'm going to signpost that question. I'm going to signpost my points. And I want my points to be constructed in a logical way that actually builds an argument and moves people through the passage, moving them from point A to point B. Make clear links between my points. Don't just bring in 3 random points out of left field. I think David was talking yesterday about how many points should a sermon be. I would say my sermons have been everything between 1 point and maybe 5 points at a max. But I would say almost 2 points would almost be where I fall a lot of the time. I kind of have a big thing about the question, and then there's often just 2 points. And I try and link those points together so people can move from one to the next without it feeling like, well, Joe's preached 2 sermons here or 3 sermons here. That's clear for me. Refer to the text. So I'm very clearly showing people how I got my idea from the text. So I want to keep referring to the text. That's something that I want to strive to do. When I prepare my sermons, I use colours in my manuscript, and where I refer to the text of the scripture, it's in a nice bright blue. And so something I can do is flip through my thing, and if I see a lot of nice bright blue, I know that I've referred to the text a lot. And so that's really helpful for me. I do my best to stay in the passage that I'm preaching on. I don't tend to jump all over the scriptures and bring in a whole bunch of other ideas. I generally only do that if the passage itself refers to other passages. So Sunday, Psalm 2 is referred to multiple times in the scriptures. So I did jump around a bit to other parts of the Bible where it was referred, but oftentimes I'm just staying in the passage. I'm really trying to show people that by them reading this passage, by them engaging with this passage, they can follow me, and they don't have to sort of feel like they need to know the entirety of the scriptures to understand what's going on. Try not to bite off more than you can chew or that you think your audience can chew. So this is important. Speaks to the number of points, speaks to the length of sermon. It speaks to how complex you're going to be with the points that you come up with. For the kids at Northside, I'm going to have one point, and it's going to be a very simple, clear point, and I'm going to try and proclaim it as quickly and as powerfully as I can. For people in church, I assume that there's a rage of ages, but I'm trying to sort of stretch people a little bit, so maybe I put a little bit more in. So try not to bite off more than you can chew as a preacher, but also more than your audience can chew. That's important when you're forming your argument. The other thing with that is level of language. How much theological language can your people understand? How can I say it in the simplest form possible so that everyone can understand it? How can I say it in a way that stretches people to understand more? They're the things that I'm thinking of when I'm trying to form my argument. Make your argument clear and simple. That if you ask somebody after the sermon, give me a sketch of my argument through that sermon, that they could go, oh, you said that we shouldn't be overwhelmed by the nations raging, and you said it was because God is the God who is sovereign, is able to laugh because he knows the end of those nations, and because God has injected himself into human history with his son, and he will put an end to their raging. Oh, great. It's simple, it's clear, it's easy to follow, people can understand it. So be clear with what you're doing and be simple with what you're doing. Don't ignore objections to the ideas that are revealed in the text. There's some things that you will say and that the scripture will say that people in your audience will go, I don't like that. I don't believe that. I don't agree with that. Especially if you've got people from a broad background coming in, other denominations who might be present, and they've got a different view of things than you do. People from the secular world. Someone's invited their friends along or their family along. Be aware that there will be objections, and think about how you are going to gently and kindly defeat those objections. So Tim Keller talks about defeater statements. Say what people's objection is, and then give a kind and gentle and loving refutation of what their objection. Think about that when you're formulating your argument. Any thoughts or questions about putting an argument together? All right, that's good. All right, we're getting closer to it's coming. Illustrations. And perhaps there's a way that I see illustrations functioning in my sermons as more than just a bit of colour or a bit of variety. I think the real heart of an illustration is for it to crystallise and cement truth. Your illustrations are supposed to illustrate something. They're supposed to make something that is maybe complex, maybe difficult, maybe hard for people to draw the lines between. It's supposed to crystallize it for them so they understand it. And it's supposed to cement things they've already understood and make it go deeper for them. Now, illustrations are double-edged swords. And it's really important to understand that just as we've talked yesterday about illustrations being things that people can just come and talk to you, and all they want to talk to you is about the story you told, that can be distracting. But there's other ways that illustrations can be a double-edged sword. It can really be powerful in cementing truth, and people can come to you and say, I've never understood that, but that analogy you gave about that, it helped me so much. Now I understand. And it's a beautiful thing when God does that for people through your illustration. But it can also go the other way. It can be really distracting for people. If you talk about something that they hate, if you talk about divisive topics, if you talk about things that they don't know about, they can just feel left out and confused. So what was it yesterday? We had a bit of a joke about Dom Toretto. I think it was Nathan made a Dom Toretto joke. Some people laughed and some people didn't. Why? Peter, who's Dom Toretto? Yeah, exactly. So you make a reference to a movie, and those who haven't seen the movie or don't understand the pop culture reference, they're lost. So it can be, you've got to be real careful with how you use illustrations. I think one thing I've found is integrated illustrations, this is what I'm calling them, I don't know if this term exists. Integrated illustrations can be really helpful. And this is an illustration that maybe you use as an introduction and you keep coming back to it. And it integrates right through the whole sermon. So a really good example of this, Ben Peacock, my associate, used a really good example of this in our 2 Timothy series. He was talking about getting things right from the start of the church. So Paul's encouragement to Timothy to sort of get things on the right track from early in the church life. And he used the phrase that a lot of builders know, which is measure twice, cut once. And then several times throughout the sermon, when he had a point and it linked back to that idea, he would say, measure twice, cut once. It's just really helpful for people because even if they didn't get it at the start, the more that you go through, it can be really helpful and help people stay engaged with the sermon. Be careful not to build the sermon around an illustration. So that really good story happens, that really good idea that you come up with for a great illustration. This will really fit well, and you kind of make the sermon fit the illustration. Let the sermon serve, let the illustration serve your sermon and serve you and serve your hearers. Don't you become a slave to it. Be sure that the illustration does what you want it to do, that it actually communicates the truth, and it's not just this random story that everyone's like, I have no idea why he told that. Aim for a variety of subject matter. I'll give you an example of this. Right at the end of last year, we were just chatting after church. You know, some of my family, like my daughter and her husband, had just flown in from Perth. They'd come to church. We're talking to people. They were excited to see them. We're just chatting, and they were kind of like, and they're like, "Oh, have you missed your dad's preaching and stuff like that?" And Emily said, "Oh, I haven't missed the sports illustrations." And I said, you know what? I'm going to go and look, because I deliberately try not to use an overabundance. I went back and looked over that whole year that I preached. I'd used 4 sporting analogies in 40-something sermons. But because of a perception that people have of me that Joe loves his sport, and because my daughters hear me talk about sport and stuff like that, they assume that sport will be used a lot in my sermons. So when I say it, they're triggered. They just think, oh, it's another sporting analogy, even though I don't use that many of them. So you've got to be careful, because people can really be put off by things, even though you don't think you know you're doing them. And so variety in subject matter to encompass a variety of people with a variety of experiences. So sometimes that means you've got to actually get outside your comfort zone and experience more of life to understand more of what's happening in the lives of your people. Take an interest in what they take an interest in. So if you're talking to them pastorally and they tell you that, like, Dino's into motorsport, I think that's an oxymoron, motorsport, but that's okay. Because from chatting to Dino over the years, when I meet other people who are into motorsport, I've got a little bit of information. You know, and so you can listen to people, if they're into something you're not into, listen to their special interest topic. They'll talk about it for hours. So listen to them and learn more, and perhaps go and do a bit of research on it, so that you might be able to use that thing to help people, especially if it's something that a lot of people are into. So if you move from here to Victoria, you know, they're going to be talking, their sport for them is AFL and pretty much nothing else. And so if you're just completely oblivious to it, you're going to miss 95% of your hearers if you don't have any idea about AFL stuff, or you can be really insensitive. Think about the value of a long illustration versus a short illustration. Sometimes it's helpful for building tension, for building emotion and passion in the sermon, to give a longer story, to give some context. Peter told us a wonderful story about his upbringing and about the time where God cemented salvation for him in his life. That was really, really wonderful to hear and really powerful. Sometimes you can communicate and illustrate a point really well with a really good longer story. Sometimes you can do it with a very clear metaphor or a very clear simile, something that takes you less than a second maybe even to say. You just sort of, everyone knows what you're talking about. And so if you use that very clear metaphor, everyone's like, I get it. So just think about the value of what's most important here, how you're trying to communicate things. Is a long story that's going to add 5 to 10 minutes to your sermon going to be valuable here? If it is, then go ahead and do it. If you think, well, maybe I can say this in one sentence, say it in one sentence. Find why you need to give the illustration and give it. Be wary of controversial topics. Be wary of movies and songs. Be incredibly wary of humour. Now, I'm not saying be unfunny and don't worry about humour. Humour is part of our human communication. Humour is part of what God has given us. It's a lovely thing to laugh with God's people, but be wary. It needs to be at the right time. You can easily let people off the hook with conviction by moving from one point to the next with a humorous story or a humorous anecdote of some kind. So be sensitive to what God is doing and what you're hoping to achieve in your sermon, and almost don't necessarily make it a goal to be, I'm going to try and be funny in this sermon. If it happens, it happens, but be really wary of it. You don't need to have funny sermons. You don't need humour to preach a good sermon. It can serve it sometimes, but it's not necessity. So always be wary of that. Any questions about illustrations? Yep, great. All right, here it is. Everyone's been waiting for it.
Come on.
How to make applications easier. All right. It's an essential part to the preaching genre. Lecture or seminar seeks to communicate information, but a sermon seeks to evoke change in the lives of the hearers. Here's a few thoughts. Spend time planning your application. Like, don't just leave it to the end. Think about it throughout the sermon. When I'm going through that initial thought process and I'm coming up with what I think is the main author's intent, I'm automatically thinking, how does this need to be applied to my people?
Yes.
And that's straight away, start thinking about it. I think, this is purely for me, you can think differently, specific application works best. I'll tell you why. Because people aren't dumb. And if you make a specific application to the one section of life in people's lives, people aren't dumb and go, well, I'm not a parent, so I don't get that. No, people aren't dumb. They can put two and two together. They don't just switch off because the application was specific to parents or not specific to them. They can join the dots. They can see how that works in the life of a parent and go, oh, that can work in my life too. People aren't dumb. They don't need to have a specific application just for them in order to understand. General application can be helpful, but I think sometimes people can just let that fly or come up with excuses as to why that isn't for them. But things that are more specific actually land it in people's lives. Cover a variety of angles and life situations. So don't just always talk to parents or always talk to husbands and wives. Don't just always talk to one facet of life. Try to think of different facets of life where this needs to be applied. Now, I can't be sure, but I think I stole this from Brian Chappell. I think it was him. It could have been someone else, so forgive whoever it is if it's not Brian Chappell. But specific questions in application are really, really helpful. This is how I frame almost every application that I make. I ask the what question. What needs to be applied? What is the truth that this passage has borne out that needs to be applied in the life of a person? So it might mean followers of Jesus model his compassion to the world around him. That might be the thing. It might be being compassionate people. That's what needs to be applied. My people need to embrace the compassion of Christ and see it overflow in their life. And so I find that's the what. When am I most likely to need this? Or when are my people most likely to encounter a need to be compassionate? I think of life situations, real life situations. When you are walking through the store, doing your groceries, and you see the single mother wrestling with her children. The children are throwing tantrums and she's trying to placate them and she's getting flustered. Is your immediate thought, that's what you get for your broken relationship. That's what you get for your bad parenting. That's what you get because you don't know what's going on. Is that your immediate thought? To be judgmental of her? Or is your immediate thought, how can I serve this lady? How can I help her and her children in this moment? So you think of the very specific, very real life. And sometimes, depending on how long it takes to do that, I'll just scattergun them. When you are, speaking with your wife, when you are speaking with your children, when you are speaking to your coworker, I just scattergun them out, these whens. Put people in a real life situation and let them feel the weight of the application of the text in that moment. And then I tell them I ask the question, how do they apply that in that situation? And so it's, don't do this, do this. I'm specific with it. So I want to ask those questions, and I try to make a habit of even presenting the application in the form of those questions so that people really get that thought crystallized in their head. At this point, you have to be really wary of legalism. You have to be wary of what you're asking people to apply and how you're asking them to apply it, that it doesn't create, this is the way we do things, and there's no other way. You don't want to be building a picture of something that's so narrow and so specific that it becomes a point of legalism, that this is the only way that we here at Rosalie deal with this issue. You want to avoid that. It's about letting people feel the weight of the application of the text in a real life moment. Be wary of application becoming too repetitive. And so yesterday, I think it was mentioned by someone, sometimes you just end up trotting out, read your Bible more, pray more, come to church more. Like, it's those core things. The specificness of the application helps prevent against that, because it's not just the same things that you're asking people to do over and over and over again. And there's a reason that, like, church attendance, reading your Bible, praying, there's a reason that those things are common applications, because the scripture's always calling us to sort of engage with God's people and engage with God, like his word and through prayer. Like, they're things that happens in the scripture a lot, but be wary of just trotting that out as the only applications you ever make, because people will just go, what's the point? That all this works for is my involvement at church or my involvement in my private worship. It's got nothing to do with my real life. Think about those real life situations. Be wary of application that's not driven by the text. So avoid going, like, this comes back to this shoehorning sort of idea. Don't let your desire to address some particular issue in the life of your church cause you to shoehorn that application in, and this is a way that you're going to have to, and then it feels very foreign, and it almost feels like you're pointing somebody out and making, going for an individual person in your congregation, because it doesn't fit. It doesn't flow from the passage. So questions, because as much as I don't like to say it after everything that was said yesterday, I don't find application to be the hardest part of preaching for me. It's not the thing I struggle with most. And it's mainly because when I was very young, I went to a preaching workshop, and I did struggle with application, found it very hard. And everyone just said, application's the thing we find hard. We've got to commit more time to it. And that was it. And then I went along to another one like 2 years later, and they said the same thing. And I went, how am I actually going to work on this? How am I actually going to find a way that works to make it easier? And so I went away and did that. And I think it was Chapel. I can't remember for sure. But those questions have been really helpful for framing my application, trying to put people in real life situations when they are going to need the application of the text. Any questions? Any thoughts? Call for response. This is something that I think is also really important to plan. Plan what you are going to call people to do, to think, to be as a response to this passage. Application specific and life, life real life application. But this call to response is the general call you are leaving with all the people who hear the sermon. Think of ways, plan a clear call to response in your sermon. So, is it going to be a call to repentance and faith? Is that where the sermon has led, and is that what you're calling people to do? Is it going to be a call to ministry action of some kind? Is it going to be a call to change, a call to persevere in trust, a call towards some action towards another person or another group of people? Really think hard about where you're going to leave the sermon. Yes. You can say to yourself, I'll just wing it in the moment. But oftentimes that's when you'll just default to the thing you always say. And so be specific, be clear, plan what you're going to call people to do. If the sermon on Sunday on Psalm 2, my big call was don't panic. The nations are raging, don't panic because God's laughing. Yeah. God's in control. Don't panic because he sent his son and appointed his son to be the one who will ride the white horse and judge people for their raginess against God. So the big call was don't panic, people. Panic is the opposite of faith. Don't panic. And so that's where I wanted to leave people. So that's what I planned as my call to respond. Just a few random things to finish, to be thinking about. Think about your transcript. And particularly if you're new to preaching and you've only preached a handful of times, you only get the odd opportunity to do it. Think about what's going to work best for you. Try to find a way, try a couple of different things, come up with a transcript that works. Mine's changed over the years. During COVID, when we were videoing stuff, I found I needed a full transcript during that time to sort of, it was such a foreign thing, just staring at a camera and preaching. And so I found that quite foreign. So I found I needed the fuller transcript, which I've kept. And the main reason I've kept it is because there's a guy in our church who's quite profoundly deaf. He's got a cochlear implant, but it still doesn't work all the time. And so he lip reads. And so after every single sermon, I go and give him the transcript and he reads over it. I get messages from him where he's taken notes on it, taken photos, things that he's loved about it. That's the main reason I keep doing it. But it doesn't really bother me at the moment what my transcript looks like. I talked about the colors that I use. I made macros on my Word so that I can just change the colors that I want just by clicking a couple of keys. So I have blue for the text that I'm preaching from, red for a text that I've brought in from somewhere else. Green is an illustration or analogy. Magenta sort of color is like things I really want to nail and stress. So my major points, my final challenge, those things are in magenta. That just helps me when I'm preaching and I look back down at my transcript. I've just told an analogy, it's green, there it is. I can find it better on the page. That just helps me with it. That's how I do that. Think about spacing in your transcript so that you're not just looking at, size 11 font Capri and text and it's just all over the whole page and it's going to be hard to follow. Think about those things, play around with it, find something that works for you, but that can be helpful too. Pre-preaching checks. So this is me Sunday morning. So I get up early Sunday morning. Well, I don't know what people call early, but I'm generally in at church at about 6:30 in the morning. And I sit down and I read through my transcript on the computer. I read through it. I'm reading through it again just to get it in my mind. I'm spending time praying for the sermon, but I'm doing these pre-preaching checks. These are the things that I'm sort of asking myself. Is it clear what the main point of this sermon is? Is it clear? Have I made that clear? Is that main point of my sermon the main point of the passage? I'm just asking myself that a question again. Have I got this right? I've done this as I've been going, but I'm sort of asking that again, just so that I can be clear in my mind. Are my applications specific and clear? Have I put the time that I needed to into those things? Then I have 4 or 5 questions that I ask myself that are based on the person I learnt them from. And so in my head, this is just how my head works. I ask myself the Piper question, which is, have I showed people from the text? And so in his book, The Supremacy of God in Preaching, Piper hammers this point. Show your people from the text. Don't just assume that they know that you're getting this point from the text. Show them. So I ask myself, have I showed people from the text? That's my Piper question. My Keller question is, have I considered modern objections to the truth here? And have I answered it gently and lovingly? That's the Piper question. Gibson is my theology lecturer, Jim Gibson, who did his master's research in the appeal to the affections in preaching or evangelism. And so I asked myself, have I appealed to the affections of my people? Because at the end of the day, the affections are where people are going to be moved. Not in a manipulative, emotional sense, in the sense that the heart is deceitful above all things, right? And so it's our hearts that need to be changed for godly action to result. And so I'm preaching to the heart, I'm preaching to the affections of people, and I ask my Jim Gibson question, have I appealed to the affections of my hearers? Now, everyone just needs to hold on and take a deep breath because Karl Barth is another question that I ask, and people have got varying views of Karl Barth. This just comes from my research into the church in Nazi Germany. And interestingly, I think if that conflict had gone on much longer, Karl Barth would have become more and more evangelical. Because I think in the panic and in the urgency of the moment, he fell back on some fairly core evangelical ideas. And so he wrote this massive treatise called Theological Existence Today. And basically his summary was, there is hope for the German churches. Even though heaps of the German church had embraced Hitler, embraced his message, thrown true theology of Christ in the bin, and were doing horrific things in the name of following Hitler, he said there's still hope for the German churches. And this is what he said. Because the German churches still possess the Bible. And in the Bible, Christ is revealed. And so I look at that and I go, I want the hope for my people to be that Christ has been revealed in this passage of Scripture for them. So that's the Karl Barth, have I showed Jesus Christ as he is revealed in this Scripture? And Andy helped us this morning deal with that. So they're just like questions that I ask. I do have another one that I asked during, which is Professor Rolly Sussex, who goes on the ABC radio sometimes and talks about language stuff. I found him very helpful for understanding how language works and how people engage with language. So where I've tried to make points, my magenta things, I've tried to make them memorable by using hit some of his techniques, because there are some things like we talked about yesterday, why 3-point sermons and things like that. Do you know people remember things best in threes? It's just a way that we engage with language, and that's why, you know, in advertising there's often threes and things like that. And so when I'm trying to communicate a point, I often use a triplet to do it. And that's kind of like my Raleigh Sussex question, which is have I communicated those in a way that people will actually engage with? So there's some questions that I ask. Spend time in prayer, and then I print it off and get ready to preach. It's kind of how it works for me. And then finally, post-preaching feedback. Post-preaching feedback for me, take general feedback with a grain of salt. Oh, thanks, Pastor, that was great today. I don't let that affect me at all. And it was really interesting. I went to a church once and I preached, and this guy came up to him and told me, that was a wonderful sermon. It was one of the best sermons I've ever heard. Thank you so much. It was just great. And he moved on. And then I happened to be in that area again, visiting on holidays. I went there and the preacher preached, and it was a visiting preacher, and it was all over the shop. Completely just crazy. And as I was walking out, this same guy had walked up. That was such a good sermon. It was the greatest sermon I've ever heard. And I just went, all right, from now on, general feedback gets taken with a grain of salt. I don't know what this guy's smoking. So take it with a grain of salt. It might be nice. You might, the longer you're in a church, the longer you're with people, you might want to push back and say, oh, what was it in particular, if you've got the time, that challenged you, so that might be more helpful. But take that with a grain of salt. Listen to another trustworthy preacher preach that passage. Might be a good way to give feedback on your sermon. Have other people come up with the same ideas that I came up with. Did they deal with it in a similar way? Did they make similar applications? That might be a good way just to review your sermon. I was saying the other day, we're getting Bill, who was here yesterday, to preach at our church camp. And when I went to listen to some sermons of his to see if he'd be appropriate for the camp, he preached through 2 Timothy earlier the year. We were just preaching through 2 Timothy at the time. So I listened to 2 of his sermons in the 2 Timothy series, one that Ben preached, one that I preached. And it was actually a good bit of feedback to see how similar the sermons were, to see that we found the same truths in the passage and explain. So it was good feedback for me to know that I wasn't Robinson Crusoe in where I landed on that passage. Seek trusted people to give specific feedback. So for us, this happens in our service review when we get to it. So Nathan's been to a few of our service reviews. But yeah, we just sit there and we want specific feedback. We want people to engage with particular aspects of the sermon, to ask questions. Why did you say it this way? Where did you get that idea from the text? Those kinds of questions. You want specific things, but you might have someone else in the church that you know, particularly a younger guy. There might be pastors or mentors. Ask for specific feedback. Ask them to give you, and especially trusted people that you know have maybe preached before, have got ministry experience. Yeah. It's really helpful. So my mentor is Peter Jenkins, who was a pastor at Cleveland back when I was at Cleveland. He's a lovely guy. I think he still helps out with mission stuff at Cleveland. Wonderful, wonderful guy. He's my mentor. Once a year he comes to Rosalie on a Sunday that I'm preaching, so that he can see how I'm preaching, give me some feedback. And it's just really helpful, I find, for him to have understanding of the context I'm in. Service review is really helpful. So if you don't do that in your church, or find some trusted people you have in the church, even if you don't think, you might be by yourself in a church and you might think, there's not much leadership capability here. I'm really starting from the ground up. That's okay. Just find 1 or 2 people that you want to work with and ask them to give you feedback. And you decide how much of that you take on, but it's really helpful to be asking people for specific feedback to your preaching. So that's what kind of sermon prep and feedback looks like for me. Any questions? Yes.
This might not be like a preparation or anything, but do you keep your sermons? Like, do you have like a big, I'm just wondering, like a big bunch of sermons that you keep?
Every sermon I've preached in probably the last 15 years or more is saved on my Dropbox. So they're all there. And that's the beauty of having an online bank, is that you've got them there. I always say to Beck, I'm like, I always want to be ready in case I turn up to a church on holiday and they say, that preacher just fell over this morning. Can you preach? Poor Josh had to do that. I actually fell, and I was supposed to preach here, and I actually fainted and smashed my head open at like 2 a.m. in the morning that I was supposed to preach. So poor Josh had to fill in at the last minute, but that's okay. That happens. So if you've got those sermons in a bank, it really does help. Yes,
What if you're covering like 7 passages?
I do look back at the sermon that I made last time. I would say probably 9 times out of 10, I'll still rewrite it. But I'll have that there as reference because, yeah, I still want to go through the discipline of working through the sermon rather than just trusting that Joe from 5 years ago was on the right page.
Yeah.
Because I know Joe from 5 years ago and
Yeah.
he wasn't always on the right page. So, any other thoughts or questions? All right. Hopefully that's been helpful.
Very helpful.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.